What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favale coming at you without my certified fantabulous co-host, Mr. Grant Hughes, but I am joined by the equally certified fantabulous Brian Toporek from Bleacher Report. We have worked together for basically eternity at this point, where he is a, what do they call you guys now? Multi-platform editor, right? MPE? That's still the title, or
Yes.
you get another bump? I'm going to call you a
We
senior multi-platform editor. I've
thank
promoted you. He is also the co-host of the NBA podcast. Go check it out. The link will be in the podcast and YouTube description. He also covers the NBA for Forbes as well as the Sixers for Liberty Ballers. Go check out all of his stuff. Follow him on the Twitter machine at B Toporek, BTOPOREK. And the links to all of his stuff, the podcast, and his Twitter profile will be in the podcast and YouTube description. Brian, how the heck are you doing?
I'm doing well, Dan. Good to see you. Thank you for having me on, as always. Love to chop it up with you guys. And yeah, it's gonna be a wild next few weeks. I'm trying to brace myself for the start of the real free agency offseason draft flop fest that is coming.
Yeah, the stuff I've been writing about, it makes me feel like it already is the off season because there's nothing to do with the playoffs of late. But if you haven't looked at the title, we're not going to get into some playoffs as we're recording this. Both teams in the conference finals, the Timberwolves and the Pacers, are down 0-3. So Grant and I'll have further analysis on conference finals or NBA finals at that point later on in the week. But Brian and I were kicking back and forth. He wrote an article on it. And then we were kicking back and forth the idea of just doing a podcast to talk about, I don't even know how to frame it. Is the super team model dead, or is the 3-star model dead, or what is going to be the repercussions of the way the new CBA is structured? Because the full breadth of penalties of the second apron, those limitations are all caking in this offseason. It's going to be absolute bedlam. I think we're talking off air about how many errors we've started to see when people are proposing trades already. And you have that on top of where I think those errors existed and like to begin with, and now they're just going to be exacerbated tenfold. And so I thought it'd be interesting. There's some of that stuff that we might touch upon, but it is a fair question now, especially when you're looking at some of the teams that are remaining and not just decisions they've made or the way they've built their teams, but decisions that are going to be forthcoming when you're looking at at least a couple of these organizations. And so I guess we'll start here to throw it to you, since this is really your baby. What is it like when we're framing it as, is the 3-star model or super team model dead? Where do you just land on that as sort of a macro topic to start?
Sure. So I feel like I was one of the first to kind of sound the alarm on the 3-star model because as I was becoming more familiar with the new CBA last offseason, it just became increasingly clear that like once you cross the second apron, your hands are so tied. And we saw that last offseason with the Phoenix Suns, who did pursue the 3-star model. They acquire Bradley Beal, but then all they can do, no taxpayer mid-level exception in free agency. They only have these minimum contracts they hand out, had some hits and misses in that regard, but you just become so top heavy if you're building a 3-star model or 3 max model up from scratch. So I think it's still possible.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be a lot harder. Your margin for error is going to be a lot lower. And I think it's just going to require more nuance. Like there is no broad, you can't do this at all, or every team can just continue building as they did under previous CBAs. Because, that is like NBA history has shown, and Daryl Morey of the Sixers continues to hammer this point, like typically the teams that have more stars have a better chance of winning. So that has been the case in the past. This new CBA, because of how it's set up and because of the restrictions on these really expensive rosters, it wouldn't shock me if that changes in the future and we start to see more teams with 2 max players and more well-rounded depth having an advantage over these 3-star models or the 3 max models. But I think there will be exceptions to that rule. And I think really the second apron is basically designed, you're just not able to add significant talent outside of minimum contracts and draft picks. So if you hit on draft picks, you're in great shape and you can maybe continue and sustain this for longer than you otherwise would. But I think if you have a core in place, like what we're seeing with Boston, I mean, Boston would be a great example of, they've got 2 guys on full max contracts in Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. They'd have Kristaps Porzingis and Drew Holiday on fairly large contracts of their own. Even Derek White is on a fairly large contract of his own. So they're well over the second apron, but they have doubled down on that. They just signed Drew Holiday to that extension not that long ago, in part because I think they feel confident in we have this core, this top 6, top 7 that we feel really good about. And if we can just continue to like surround those guys with, we just need like 1 or 2 more playable players in the playoffs, and we'll be fine. So I think there will be examples like that where teams can sustain these very expensive models, stay over the second apron for a couple years and be fine. But I do think in general, we can't just lean on history tells us 3 stars works, because yes, that it was the case in the past, but these new rules were not in place. There was not as much of a penalty for going way over the tax, where now, like before, it was just, oh, you're $30 million over the tax. Okay. You've got a taxpayer mid-level exception, and that's about it. Then you're
which has gotten smaller as part of the new CBA too.
Right. And yeah, like the room mid-level got bigger, I believe, as part of it as well. So there are more advantages granted to teams under the second apron, especially. And I think these teams over will have a chance, but I'm skeptical that many of them, especially building from the ground up, it would not be how I would choose to build a team moving forward.
And it's so for anyone who might not be familiar with it, I know we've covered it on this podcast a lot, but so the second apron, it's set at it's 18 million above the first the luxury tax. And so once you hit it, and you can add whatever limitations, I forget because I'm about to rattle it off. You cannot take back more money than you send out in trades when you're in the second apron. You cannot aggregate salary. So that means, if you're the Celtics, you cannot trade Al Horford and Derek White to Team X to get a more expensive player than Al Horford and Derek White. You can, however, trade one player for multiple players as long as the sum of the players coming back is less than what you're sending out. You don't get, you already said that you're not going to have your mid-level, the taxpayers mid-level exception will not be available to you. You can't use any traded player exceptions that were created in previous years. So what you could still do is if you make a trade in the same league calendar year, I guess you get to retain that exception, but I also don't I guess that would be the loophole too. Well, how are you supposed to actually use it if you can't take back more money than you're sending out? You're allowed to then still absorb a player into that. It's that's a potential loophole, but not really a big one. This one was already kicked in, but you can't sign anyone on the buyout market who was making more than the non-taxpayers mid-level, which this year was 12.4 or whatever it was. There's the frozen draft pick too. So your draft pick gets frozen 7 years out. And then if you're, what is it? If you're in the second apron for 3 of 5 years, or is it 3 of 4?
I believe it's 2 of 4.
2 of 4. That's going to get moved to the bottom of the draft. The bottom of the first round, excuse me. You can unfreeze it though by climbing out of the second apron for that same span, right? It's consecutive seasons, I think.
Yeah, I think it's just yeah.
So did I forget any major limitations?
Can't send out cash in trades either, so you can't buy second round picks, which, considering how restricted you are otherwise, that would be a way to supplement your roster, and now you can't do that either. But yeah, those are all the big ones.
So I have so many follow-up questions, but I think I'll start here. So you mentioned teams that would still be able to do it, kind of the way that Boston did it. We know that every owner or every team governorship, they're going to have a limit for how long they're going to float it. And so for these teams that do go into the second apron for whatever reason, I do think that it's, we already thought that title windows were kind of short because some contracts were shorter, the way that trade demands have been working. It does feel like then an unintended consequence of this is that they could get even shorter, or we even see teams, let's say let's use just Denver as an example. I'm not saying they're do this, but we just listed all those limitations that they'll be a second apron team basically if they keep Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. Now, if he leaves, they could duck it if they wanted to. Are we going to see teams like title windows will not be shortened just because they don't want to float the second apron for so long, but they're just going to claim it's too limited, too restrictive to begin with to go in it. So you're going to let them, they couldn't keep Bruce Brown last summer, but maybe they decide to let KCP walk and say, well, we kind of got to rest on cheaper talent because we want to be able to, maybe they'll spin it as we want to be able to aggregate salaries in trades, or we don't want to not have these taxpayer mid-levels available to us moving forward. And so do you think that that's something that we could, where it's not even like these already built contenders might be short-circuited in a way that doesn't even necessarily involve them being in the second apron for 1, 2, or 3 years or however long they're willing to float it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a possibility. And I think that's something that these cap space teams are kind of banking on, that they might be able to get talent for a lot cheaper than they otherwise could be. It's similar to what we saw with Atlanta last year when they salary dumped John Collins for Rudy Gay and 1 second-round pick after having him on the trade block for 3 years. And I forget what their asks were, but I'm sure it was at least 1 first-round pick.
Mm-hmm.
And now Atlanta wasn't a second apron concern. That was just luxury tax in general, and looking down the line and seeing that we just need to get off of this guy. But I absolutely think there are going to be teams that don't want to be in the second apron or don't want to stay in the second apron and are willing to move off of talent for less than their the talent themselves would be worth. One kind of similar example, and I think we're seeing with the Clippers right now, sign Kawhi to this 3-year below max extension in January. Now we're hearing Paul George, and we're finally, over the last 2 days, we're finally getting the contract details that they are reportedly willing to offer him. And it is supposedly Keith Pompey of the Philadelphia Inquirer had it yesterday, and then I saw Kevin O'Connor of the Ringer had it today. They're drawing the line at the same exact contract with Paul George that they did with Kawhi Leonard, which is 3 years, about $10 million less than the max that they could offer him. And so Lawrence Frank at his end of season press conference said, look, we want to keep Paul George. We love what he brings to the table. Let me see if I can find the exact quote because I have it pulled up somewhere. He specifically mentioned, he says, the elite player, and our biggest thing is we always want to be able to treat players well and pay them fairly. And we also have to build out a team, especially this is the new CBA. That is just a warning shot of we're not willing to do the 35% maxes for all three guys. We have to be mindful of this in a way that
we're willing to go as far out as you theoretically could as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they could have signed Kawhi to a 4-year, $220 million deal. They could have signed Paul George to a 4-year, $220 million deal, and they don't want to with either guy. And it's just really interesting because Steve Ballmer, one of the appeals when Steve Ballmer took over the team was this man is richer than God. There is nothing stopping him from just outspending every other team. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, now there might be.
And this summer might be a bad analog for it or a test case, but James Harden might be, and we saw it last summer. Do you think we're going to get to a point, or are we already there? Because if Paul George signs somewhere else, if he goes to the Sixers, he's getting the max. It would be shocking if he left the Clippers for less than the max. But stars kind of in their actually hitting the open market or up for these new deals in their early mid 30s, where the deal is going to take them into their mid or late 30s. Are we going to be past the point where those, maybe there's still a select, LeBron done full max, whatever he wants, but the top 20, 25 guys, because James Harden, it's such a tough to use him as an example because I just don't know what team actually wants to sign him aside from the Clippers. It's not that James Harden is bad. It's just that what is the market for James Harden when you're looking at the teams with cap space? Are we going to be past the days of those stars getting max money, and maybe even 3-year deals or 4-year deals that they could sign? Is that something that's it feels like we're kind of already, we're ankle deep in it now. We're dipping our toes in. There's that being floated, but we're going to get to a point where it's, oh, you're 33. Oh, Paul George is 34. No, we're not going to max that guy.
It wouldn't shock me. I mean, I think it also probably depends on if you have 2 stars, maybe you're willing to do it. Whereas if you have 3, you're not. I think with Harden last summer, I mean, who knows exactly what went down with him in the Sixers, but it wouldn't shock me if he got the feeling that they weren't willing to offer him the max, and that's why he got upset. But as it turns out, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe the Clippers will max him, but if they're not maxing Paul George or Kawhi Leonard, I don't think they're going to max James Harden too. It would not shock me if, the 3 years, 150 million is the most they're willing to offer him, maybe even less. So they, like, the Sixers might have just had the right read on James Harden's value sooner than James Harden did, and it might have frustrated him. But now we get a year later, and as it turns out, they were probably right. He's probably going to be forced to settle for at least something less than the max, and at least something. I would be shocked if they're willing to do 4 years for him if they're only willing to do 3 years
Right.
for Kawhi. I would imagine they're trying to line up all of those deals. So yeah, to your point, I mean, like, a LeBron James is going to get a max until the day he retires. Like, if Kevin Durant became a free agent, I think he would still get a max. But I mean, we saw even Kyrie last summer. Obviously, a lot of off-court stuff with him that teams had to consider, and there wasn't a robust market for him in free agency. But he took like $10 million less than his max starting salary. And honestly, I think we're at a point. I wrote about this like in September. The money is just so absurd right now, and it's only going to get more outrageous. I mean, with these new TV deals that are coming, if the reports are accurate, like, the cap's probably going to go up 10% starting next year through the remainder of the decade. And I wrote something at BR recently just about, like, the absurd value of contracts that could be coming down the pike. Like, by the end of the decade, we're talking about like 5-year, $450 million deals. So,
but based off how you expect it to go up and when to reach that point, who will be the first $100 million per year player in the NBA?
It was Anthony Edwards was my guess. It was like the 29, I think it was the 29, 20. The guys who signed 5-year max extensions starting this year, when they come off their next deal, the final year, it was like 33, 34, I believe, was when you hit the $100 million salary. But
preemptive
like,
congratulations to Anthony Edwards on becoming
that's right. Yeah,
100 million per year. Even though it's all percentages of the salary cap, you do get to a point where the numbers are just bonkers.
But like, that's what I'm wondering is, like, at what point do the numbers become so outrageous that players stop being fixated on the percentage and are just like, you know what? I'm eligible for 5 years, 450 million. I'm good with like 5 years, 300 million. Because that's going to give them a huge competitive advantage over all of these other stars and other teams. I mean, like, we heard, Steve Popper of Newsday reported recently, or it might have gotten misaggregated, about the Jalen Brunson, that he might be willing to take, what is it, like a 4-year, $156 million extension this summer. If he doesn't and he becomes a free agent in 2025, he's eligible for 5 years, $270 million. I mean, if he takes 156, that's still an ungodly amount of money, right? Like, what are you going to do with that amount of money? But that also opens so many more doors.
Maybe we'll have Draymond Green on the podcast and he'll explain to you how NBA players are actually poor because of all the fines that most of them actually do not have to pay.
If Jalen Brunson starts getting fined for all of his flopping, maybe he will be broke after the 156 million. But yeah, I mean, that could be a huge competitive advantage for the Knicks if they have him. They already have him on a way below market deal. If he takes that extension, that's another below market deal, and that's going to open opportunities for them to spend elsewhere that other teams aren't going to have those opportunities for. So when Kawhi signed that extension with the Clippers, I thought that was a signal that, like, Paul George and James Harden were on board. We're all going to take
3 years
below. Yeah, and maybe that will end up being the case. Maybe it won't be, but that's what, like, if I'm a GM, that's what I'm trying to find is, like, who is willing to not necessarily fixate on I'm eligible for 30% or 35% of the cap. I'm just fine with this giant 9-figure check, and if it's 31% instead of 35, that's cool.
And I'm wondering because, and I think LeBron, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade started this a little bit, even though the grand scheme of how much money they actually gave up. But right after that was 2010 when they formed in Miami, a lot of the discussion was about, well, will players be willing to take pay cuts to do this and that? And just based off what you're saying, I understand the money's ridiculous, but now it feels like the onus is going to be on, if you want to have a third star, if you want to have depth, real meaningful depth around your superstars, not that necessarily the responsibility, because it doesn't. They could just say, no, I want my max money. Let's just move on. And there are certain players where both teams are just going to pay it because they're that good. But it feels like that discourse is gonna, where it kind of faded into the background. It feels like over the past, I don't know, decade or so, or just for a while. Then now that's going to come back and creep into the conversation where it's, well, maybe they'll just be willing to take less to make room for others. Maybe not so much as will this free agent take less, but more so of these incumbent players when they're getting into extensions, or even if they just are free agents re-signing with their own teams, where it was just even like, think about how much less Carmelo Anthony took when he re-signed with the Knicks in whatever year that was with Phil Jackson. They asked him to take a certain amount. He took it. It was still such a negligible amount. And now we're talking about, okay, maybe the percentage will still seem negligible, but it's going to be such these massive dollar amounts that I'm wondering, and this is not something I necessarily thought about until you just said that, is the whole, well, will player X or star X take a pay cut so that they can play with other star X? Is that going to become more in vogue again all of a sudden?
Right. I think it should, right? I think that the first group of stars that does it and they're willing to take a pay cut together to team up will be at a huge advantage over the ones that continue to say, I'm eligible for 35%. I want my full 35%. Like, again, with the Clippers, there's only 10 million less than Kawhi's max that he signed for. So it's still not a gigantic amount that he gave up, but that will just give them more flexibility. And maybe they stay over the second apron, in 24, 25, but maybe all three of those guys taking less puts them under in 25, 26, or maybe, the way I forget the exact structure of Kawhi's contract, but it is not going up. Like, it's a 35% max in 24, 25, and then it's fixed amounts for the next 2 years. So if the cap goes up 10% from 24, 25 to 25, 26, and Kawhi's salary, I think it only goes up like 1% or something like that. That's going to give them more flexibility down the line. So I think that's the path. That's the easiest path. If you want to build a 3 max model or a 3-star model from scratch, you got to get these guys to take less. And to your point, it's going to end up being significantly less as we get further into the decade. Then I think it's more viable. I think it's just hard. The teams that draft well and that have 3 stars in place, like OKC is another example of a team. I don't know their ownership's willingness to spend into $50 million over the luxury tax line. So I think that's probably what could derail them. But like, they are the obvious example of, they have 3 stars in place with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Williams, Chet Holmgren. They've got 1 million draft picks. They have, Josh Giddey, who they can trade this summer as part of a package for someone else. Like, they have the ability to continually replenish their supporting cast. So I actually think OKC could do a 3-star model, even once they re-sign Chet and J-Dub. Because who knows if those guys could be on 25% maxes too. Like, there is a difference, a substantial difference, and it's only going to get
10% difference.
Yeah, but 25% on next year's cap is $35 million. 35% is $49 million. Like, and it's only going to get bigger as the years go on and the cap gets bigger. So, I think the whole narrative of like, super teams are dead, we can't do the 3 max thing. Like, I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think there will still be cases where you can, and it's going to be like, okay, can you build a 3 max team where each guy is earning 35% maxes, and we're signing all of these guys in one summer or trading for all of them in one summer? Probably not. Can you do a 3 max where it's, one guy's on a 30 and 2 guys are on a 25, and you've got 15 first round picks in the next 7 years, and you've already got a supporting cast in place? You've at least got a better shot.
Yeah, and so OKC is a great example of that, because it does feel like you're going to need to, we're using the 3-star model as an example. Even Cleveland to some degree could be this, where it's like the players are at different stages of their maxes, whereas Donovan Mitchell could be on a 30% max, and then you're going to have 2 25% maxes with Garland and Mobley, which Garland specifically will not come close to being 25% of the cap as it goes up. But you also run into an issue of, in their case, if you have enough players that have either been on the fun max for long enough, or in Jared Allen's case, which I don't expect him to be there much longer, but like those guys are going to get massive raises, it gets more difficult. And that's the thing with OKC is, okay, in theory, they're the team to do it. But like if they hit on someone else who also
Mhm.
requires a max at some point, that's where it gets tricky. And this is also why, by the way, and I've been an advocate of, like, if you told me they went out and they traded for Larry Markkinen over the summer, I would love it. But it's also why I think we're going to see teams be more cognizant of not even just how many years are left on a player's deal. That'll certainly matter, but what their next deal is going to look like. Because if you know that you're going to have J Dub and Chet have kick in with 25% maxes on what could be the same year that Shea's super max kicks in, like you don't want to, you can't have that fourth max or near max player. And that's why if you see them make moves, it's probably going to be for someone cheaper or someone they're prepared to lose sooner.
Mhm.
Just because they have to plan around, okay, it's great. They could have these 3 stars there, but they still have to pay them and figure out a way to make it sustainable. And we're also, even if teams do this right, very few of them are ever going to have the draft stash that OKC does. And so how long are you even able to float that realistically? Because I'm assuming we're also going to see teams not throw away, even if it ends up working out. Because, like, as Brian Windhorst says of ESPN, like, you don't have to apologize if you ever win a title. But like, we're
Mhm.
going to reach a point where we kind of look back on these Rudy Gobert trades, the Mitchell trades, even ones that don't seem bad, right? Like, look at what happened, how we're remembering the Paul George trade to the Clippers now. And that wasn't in the moment, anyone would have made that deal. But like, are we
Mhm.
just going to see these ultra distant first round picks be thrown around less and less? And so you're not even going to have these instances where teams have all these extra draft picks. Maybe having all your own is enough to say, well, we'll draft, develop, and replenish that way around these trio of maxes. But when you're looking at OKC, yeah, it would be wild if they traded for a star, and they certainly could. But that just means that, oh, they're eventually. And by the way, this isn't saying anything of what if J Dub or Chet Holmgren, like they could make all NBA and wind up having 30% maxes, like
Yeah.
instead of 25%, depending on the language and the extensions they eventually agree to. So it even makes building your team, if you have those 3 like cheaper stars, even makes it more difficult because you constantly have to plan around, well, they could be more expensive than we thought. Or like if we're going to bring talent in, you're eventually going to have to pay them. And it's just like the Nuggets, yeah, they're expensive at the top more so than other teams, but it's all of a sudden, okay, like we have our 2 core stars, like, well, Jamal Murray will be a free agent after next season, technically, but okay, we have our stars in place, but that's, oh, KCP, a critical role player, is like, he needs to get paid. It's like, are we
Mhm.
going to even see maybe more of that where these top, maybe they're not the stars on the roster, but these top 3, top 4, top 5 players on the roster, they end up getting moved around even more often because you're trying to figure out how to foot the bill for your 2 or in some cases 3 stars.
Right. And Denver, if I remember correctly, I believe Aaron Gordon is also a free agent or has a player option in 25, 26, but will probably decline that and become a free agent as well. So not only do they have to worry about KCP this summer, but Jamal Murray is eligible for an extension. I believe Aaron Gordon is also now eligible for an extension. And, if not, do you run the risk of losing one of those guys? Like, that's why we're hearing, you know, I've seen Denver fans floating, like, should we consider trading Michael Porter Jr.? Because that's like, you're getting increasingly locked in. And I think
Mhm.
I think that is fundamentally what the second apron is designed to do. It's designed to lock you into your team as much as possible. And you can't add talent the way that teams under, especially like under the cap or even under the tax or even under the first apron, like all of those teams are going to have far more flexibility in building out their roster than you with, this, the no aggregation thing, especially. I think it's just a huge change. It's like,
Right.
I think it's being kind of underplayed of how much of a seismic change between that and not being able to take a penny more in salary than you send out. It's just going to make it really hard to come up with trades that make sense where this second apron team is technically like the quote unquote winner of the deal. And they also can't trade, first round pick 7 years in the future anymore. Like, that's no, a lot of these teams have already traded away their near term capital. So like a team like Denver, for I think they were kind of smart in the way they were so proactive about, even during the finals last year, they made the trade to get more draft capital, and they've intentionally been saying like, all right, we're gonna lose Bruce Brown, we're gonna lose Jeff Green, we're gonna lean on our young guys more I know they're saying like in retrospect, we wish we gave them even more opportunity during the regular season. But I think this is the way that if you do this 3-star thing or this 3 max thing, you are going to have to lean on draft picks and young players more than other teams are going to. And that's, that could lead to something like we saw in Denver, where it costs them a chance of repeating as a champion. But, for all we know, next year, those guys are all going to be more seasoned and more experienced. And maybe they come back significantly better. And all of a sudden, Denver feels more sustainable than it might right now.
That's going to make coaching a lot harder because even in Denver, Peyton
Yeah.
Watson plays a fairly prominent role for you all season, and then it's Justin Holiday time as soon as you get to the
Yeah.
Wolves. And I know matchups matter, but like and I saw a lot of people point out, well, it wasn't the depth that was an issue. It was the fact that the starting lineup got killed. And it was, yeah, for sure. But does the starting lineup play better if they like weren't being leaned upon as much as they
right.
So there's like you could make all sorts of different arguments for it. And less about the actual type of contract. So yes, the 3-star model is still possible. I do think we're going to see like so many different variations of it. We already mentioned, these guys are at different stages of their career where it's, they have a 35% max and then 25% max guys, or a 35, a 30, and a 25. Just that difference. Even having 35% guys, that even feels like super tenuous now. And that's what I'll ask you about later. But I feel like one of the things that's going to change is it's not just, do we have the stomach for this for X amount of years? And I'll just be curious to see how long a group like Phoenix lasts. And they might be a bad example just because, and this is the question I'm about to get into, it now seems to matter even more which 3 stars you have on your roster. Because the way that Phoenix is, like, it almost feels like you need a 1-3-5. I know that we don't love positions around here, but like, if you want 3 stars, it's 1-3-5. Because we're seeing in Phoenix where it's like, okay, I think Devin Booker's basically could be a point guard. I know some people still disagree with me based on how the season ends. So you have 2 2s and then like a combo forward or wing, whatever you want to call Kevin Durant, who, if we really want to downsize, you could play him at center. And this is what you end up with is, okay, well, Yusuf Nurkic is now your best center. You can't find any of these athletic wins to help you play defense. And you now, if you want a point guard, it's not going to be a very good point guard unless Kyle Lowry or someone wants to come to you for the minimum. And so do you think like teams are always, I would assume, going to be more particular about how they would build these 3-star like factions now, but it almost feels like, well, the days of kind of just like, I know shot creation is important and you still want it, but like we're going to have to divvy up like the actual functional, even the positionality of it all, because you don't want to have too much of it truncated into this one type of skill set or not give yourself enough positional flexibility elsewhere, to where Phoenix might be the extreme, to where it's just like there's not a single like wing or 5 among the bunch. And it's like, if you're going to do that, you need to at least have a wing or your 5. Like the star needs to be like, there needs to be, or multiples. We've seen it with the Clippers, but it's going to have to be, yeah. And I would even take it a step further where it's, because we're kind of seeing it now, is with that. Well, let me just start there to throw it to you. There's like, do you think we're going to see teams be more specific about sort of the types of players, if they are going to go the multi-star or 3-star routes, that they are acquiring and paying?
I think they should. I don't know if they will, but I mean, I figure I 100% agree with you. And, I obviously cover the Sixers pretty closely. So they have this opportunity to add a 3rd star this summer. And, Sixers Twitter is just up in arms right now about, arguing Paul George versus Donovan Mitchell versus Jimmy Butler versus Brandon Ingram. I'm lower on Mitchell. Like, I have full respect of what he can do. I mean, I saw what he did against Orlando, saw what he did against Boston. Like, he's an incredible player. I think he makes sense for a lot of teams. He would be surprisingly low on my list of star targets, whether trade or free agency, for the Sixers, for that exact reason. They have Tyrese Maxey, they have Joel Embiid. If you're gonna do the 3-star thing, which by all accounts they are, I think it has to be a wing, because otherwise it's a math problem, right? Like, you just run into, okay, you can get Donovan Mitchell and he's at 35 million this year, so you might still have 30-ish million in cap space left, or 25 million, I forget the exact number. But like, you have to build out the rest of your roster with that amount of money. Like, how are you going to have the wing depth other than get really lucky and sign Kelly Oubre Jr. for a minimum contract, or sign Derrick Jones Jr. for a minimum contract?
Right.
These guys like wildly outplay the value of their deal, but then they're up for a new deal next summer anyway, and you can't retain them. you're gonna have to just run. You're gonna run into this problem where you have to like continue either finding these free agent steals every summer, which you can feel confident in your front office's ability to identify talent that might be underused or could thrive in your system, but it's a difference between, okay, we identified this and 29 other teams are also bidding for them. Like, why are they taking the minimum from us versus them?
We're gonna
So
see a lot
I
of like 1+1s, but the +1's a team option instead of a player option now. Is like that's how the teams are gonna try and, or we're gonna see a lot of like the sort of Nick Batum situations where it's just re-sign with us and wink wink, you'll have
yeah,
early bird rights next summer and we'll take care of you.
yeah, that would not shock me. And I think that's honestly smart strategy for a lot of teams if they can convince guys to do that. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think the 1-3-5 or however you want to frame it would be the smart approach. Because I think one of the things with Phoenix that went kind of under the radar when Grayson Allen got hurt in that first round series, like no one is pointing to the Grayson Allen injury as the reason why they lost that series. Obviously it's like, oh, the three stars didn't perform as well as they needed them to, and like, sure, that is a huge factor, but also Grayson Allen is one of the only guys not on a minimum contract on that team, and he was shot 47% from 3-point range during the regular season. Like, you are just so top heavy that if one of your non-minimum guys goes down, again, your margin for error is just so much lower because
Mhm.
now you've got 4 guys on non-min deals and then 10 other guys on min deals, basically, and you're just praying that you have enough of those guys who hit. And if they do, they're up for a raise and you have to do it all over again the next summer.
Do you think will Phoenix be a good case study in if they just sort of run into this problem where they have like all these guys are just on mega maxes, let's go like the full tilt maxes? Are they going to be a case study to see how long a team is actually willing? Because I think the way that they're built is they're not going to be a success story. Just like
All
there's
right.
too many holes to fill. So like they could end up being a cautionary tale, which they will be, but are they going to be a good just because the way Matt Ishbia comes in and says not just 26 other teams want to be him, but or be the Suns, but also that he just doesn't give a shit about draft picks, which is
Mhm.
I do not want to. I said this in the last podcast. So I don't mean to be the person that keeps saying it, but I understand it's about the now. I have no desire to be a Suns fan by 20, 29, 30 at this point. I am scared shitless if they're actually going to be chucking away their future picks on top of that. So, but are they going to be maybe a good case of like, well, like what is, or is it the Clippers? Like, how long are they actually willing to, if you do this? Because it's going to
Mhm.
happen. There's going to be a team that says, why not us? And maybe
Yeah.
it works out for them, but are they going to be a good, or is there an organization you look at? Maybe it's even Boston who built their team much differently than the way that the Clippers and the Suns have. Like, what is the team you look at? Like, okay, well, if someone's going to try this and they're really going to try and float it, that's the good case study to see how long they're actually willing to do it for. Because every team will reach their break. We heard the Warriors would never reach it because they could print money with their new arena. And then Joe
Mhm.
Lacob goes on a podcast in February and says, "Oh, we're not just trying to duck the second apron next year. We want to be outside the luxury tax." Every team has their breaking point. So is there just a team out there that you look at as, okay, well, how long are you willing or trying to float? Like that's the team I'm just going to be looking to see how long they stay together.
Yeah, I mean, like every second apron team is the cheating answer. But I think they're all unique in their own ways. So Phoenix, because it's the 335% maxes, and you got people with the no trade clause, which just totally hamstrings them. Because like I'm sure if Beal did not have that no trade clause, they'd salary dump him this
I
summer.
would, this is an aside. Do you think if they wanted to negotiate the no trade clause, like veto it, like after the trade was done, would he have been like, no, I'm not going to Phoenix? Like if they would have made that a stipulation, I'm just wondering why that wasn't more of a storyline
Yeah,
or an
that's a
attempt
good
by Phoenix to
question.
do that.
Yeah, I have no idea either way. I mean, I guess Phoenix might have been nervous. Did someone else come over the top because they didn't have a ton to offer? So it was like we're getting Bradley Beal, quote unquote, on the cheap. They didn't think critically about why that might be the case, and that here we are a year later.
That's my other pet peeve too. And you kind of outlaid it when you were talking about Phoenix's pick and depth situation where we're like, well, they just shouldn't have traded for Beal. And it was like, if you have a problem with where the Suns are at, the Cardinal sin, and I'm not saying it was, but the Cardinal sin was trading for Kevin Durant. It wasn't trading for Bradley Beal.
Right, right. Or
I'm
I mean, they shouldn't have. They should have just done Durant and Booker, and then built depth around them. They shouldn't have tried the 3-star thing, but they, it felt like hubris got the best of them, and they thought, well, we can just outscore anyone. So who cares about defense? Or we're just gonna sign 10 minimum guys, and they're all gonna be great for us, and nothing to see
I'm not
here.
gonna lie, I drank that Kool-Aid when I looked at their minimum signings last year. I thought
Yeah,
I trumpeted those things up,
I
and
mean they did as well as they could have. That's what's
right.
tricky. Like I mean maybe not as well because like
They
yeah,
didn't get
Kelly Oubre
Derrick Jones
Jr.
Jr., but like
Right.
it's harder to hit. Like that just doesn't happen. Derrick Jones Jr. might be like him and Kelly Oubre Jr. honestly might be one of the two best minimum signings of the decade. At the like
Right.
the single two best minimum signings of the decade at this point.
These are just like outliers, and I think teams are going to be overly confident in their ability to identify them and find these guys and sign these guys, and I just don't think you're going to have a huge success rate with them. They're earning a minimum contract for a reason. Um, yeah, so like Suns are one example. Clippers, we're seeing that they do not want to do the 35% maxes. Minnesota is going to be a really interesting example. I mean, we heard, especially with this ownership spat going on, like A-Rod and Mark Lore had this plan of, cutting salary. Like, are they willing to, fresh off a conference finals appearance, like their best season in 20 plus years, basically, are they willing to run it back, or are they nervous with Edwards, Cat, Gobert, and Jaden McDaniels not on a max deal but on a pretty substantial contract of his own? Are they willing to run it back next year, or how much longer are they willing to do? Boston, I know other front offices are looking at Derek White and they're saying, "Ooh, okay, you've got Tatum and Brown on the 35% maxes, or you're about to have Tatum on 35% max. You have KP and Drew Holiday signed for a couple more years now. Are you able to keep Derek White beyond 24-25? Like, could we potentially see him hit the free agent market, or are they going to try to offload him? Memphis, I think we saw in a little bit at the trade deadline where they moved off with Steven Adams, and that helped believe that they're now at least projected to be under the second apron. They've got a team option on Luke Kennard. What happens with that? Are they willing to,
Go into
keep
the
him
tax at
around?
all.
Right. Right. Or yeah, do they just waive him? Like I would imagine he has value. Like I think they could, probably get
If they waive
enough.
him, I'm gonna need to see like the reports on his knees. Like there's got to be like nothing in there. If they actually just decide, oh no, we're waiving him. We don't want to try and trade him or get him a shot. I'm just like, oh, are his knees just gone? Like
Yeah, they very well might be. But I could see Memphis is at least like a small market example of how much our team's willing to push this moving forward. So I think each team is in its a unique circumstance, so it's going to be hard to draw like big picture lessons from one to the other of like, oh well, Phoenix didn't work, so the 3-star model just can't work anymore. Like I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think there will be specific things like for Phoenix having no draft picks or having very little draft capital moving forward to replenish your roster. I think if you do the 3-star thing, you're going to need draft picks. You're going to need a lot of draft picks because that's going to be the cheapest, easiest way to replenish your roster, get guys on long-term deals. And look, you're probably going to miss more than you hit. But if you get, like Miami gets a Jaime Jaquez Jr. and all of a sudden that would, like, if you put Jaime Jaquez Jr. on the Suns right now, you're feeling a lot better about their future. So, I think draft picks in general, that would be one big takeaway for me, or at least one that I think it will apply not just situationally for all of these 3 max models. Like, I think that is something that they're going to have to value. But overall, it's, I think the only, like, other thing that will apply across all of them is you just have to either be very lucky or very good with your minimum signings because you're going to have to lean on a lot of them.
I also wonder if that spills into the draft, thinking of we're not just drafting the best player available at number 27,
Mm-hmm.
like we're going best fit because we're not used to seeing these. Because you even reach a point, look at Denver, which maybe Michael Malone and Kevin Booth weren't totally on the same page, but like you reach a point where it was, no, it's not Peyton Watson. Like we're going to trust Justin. Justin Holiday played pretty well against the Wolves. I'm not necessarily belittling that decision. But like you're going to end up drafting for fit rather than these projects, which I don't know if that's damaging, or it would even just be novel to see a team like Phoenix where your window is so much shorter than in theory a team like Denver's where it's like Jokic still has time left. There's like he has time left on his cut, like as your single best player, but where the windows are more finite to then have to think about okay, like developing youth, it would just be so uncharacteristic of what we usually see from teams in that position.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that is a change that would not shock me at all if we're seeing like draft some of the upperclassmen more college ready or more NBA ready guys that have had more experience rather than these freshmen who, probably aren't going to be ready to make an impact in your rotation for 2 or 3 years. When, as you said, when title windows are more finite, you're not going to have the opportunity to reap the benefits of these guys until your window is either closed or you're moving on to your next window. I mean, the other factor there is like how NIL impacts all of this. Are more guys staying in college?
Oh.
Like the top 10, 5 prospects, whatever, they're all going to come out because you are going to make a lot more money in the NBA. But, do we see more guys go back to school? Do we see more NBA ready upperclassmen in the draft moving forward because they're now able? And I just saw like the NCAA last week had the settlement. Now schools are allowed to pay
Oh yeah.
athletes directly. I mean, that won't go into effect, I would imagine, for a little bit of time, but like there are going to be some ripple effects of NIL already. We're seeing it, especially in the NFL draft. Like this was a draft where there were fewer, teams were like banking on being able to sign fewer undrafted free agents because more guys went back to college because of NIL. Like, do we start to see that in the NBA as well? And do teams,
It'd be funny.
it might be a good thing for teams.
Right. I'm just thinking of, because now let's say when they're able to pay players, it just would have been funny if like there's a bidding war between, or it's not necessarily a bidding war, but it's, oh, should Wemby have gone into the NBA draft? Or it's like UNC is offering him like more than he would get on his NBA rookie scale at the number. Like I would just be
Right.
curious to see what would happen in that respect. This is so I'm monitoring the Celtics, I think, because they're a rare case, and like OKC to some extent, but just like the guys aren't on maxes yet. But
Mm-hmm.
their window is so much more open-ended. Where the Clippers, they kind of had that, but now they've reached DEFCON 1 in terms of urgency because of the age of their guys, and they doubled down, tripled down, whatever, when you go and get James Harden. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Jason Tatum's only 19. And he's 25. He wrapped up his age 25 season. Jaylen Brown just wrapped up his age 27 season. There's no reason if those two are your core pieces, I know Drew Holiday's a little bit over. Derek White will be his age 30 season next year. Kristaps, this was only his age 28 year. When it's more open, and by open-ended, I mean, we see windows like just close. It feels like 3 years, 4 years, like maybe max, even sometimes shorter than that. If you have a pathway to where it's even longer, and the Celtics are kind of in the midst of a window that's even longer than that, that's what I'll be looking at to see, okay, if they want to keep those two players in place, how are they reacting with the core guys who are around them? And so you're right that you can't necessarily relate it to what Phoenix and the Clippers are doing, but there's like, it would be easier for the Clippers or the Suns to just pull the ripcord because you could say, just like, look at the ages of 2 or all 3 of our stars. And just like it wasn't happening. In Boston's case, there's just more of that extended timeline. And so how do you go about, is it just you stomach it for as long as these two are bringing you to the conference finals and the NBA finals? Or is it, well, we're not getting rid of one of them, where I know everyone's kind of painted Jaylen Brown as the guy that will eventually become collateral damage. But we're going to, the Derek White becomes collateral damage. Maybe Drew Holiday at some point, or Kristaps, one of those two, maybe all of them, except for those two. That's why I'm so fascinated by Boston's situation, because it's they're in a window that's, they've moved around again, the pieces that have surrounded those two a lot, but like they're in the midst of this window that could, if they just have Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum there and they're healthy and you give them a reasonable roster, like we are talking about a contention window that spans longer than a half decade.
Yeah. I mean, I would have bet like they're presumably, barring a historical collapse, going to make the finals this year. I'd imagine Dallas is also very likely to make the finals. I would think Boston is going to be favored over Dallas, although who knows how that series plays out. But, with the success they've had, I would be shocked if they like preemptively moved off of Derek White just because he could become a free agent in 2025. Like, I think they're going to run the same group back next year. I think they made a couple moves at the deadline with, acquiring Jaden Springer and then Xavier Tillman in particular, in ways that they would not be able to acquire them this offseason. So it was basically their pre-agency at the trade deadline. I would imagine they're going to aim to re-sign Tillman or Luke Cornett and have a back, have one of those guys be the third stringer to Porzingis and Horford. I mean, Horford is still somehow effective, but is, getting up there in age, so they need to start planning for him long term. So it wouldn't shock me if like 2025, that offseason is the pivot point, or at least where they have to start considering some bigger changes. Because at that point, Porzingis will also be heading into the final year of his deal. He'll be a free agent in 2026, unless he signs an extension before then. But I mean, they've got Brown, Tatum. I mean, Tatum. I keep saying Tatum's gonna sign a 5-year supermax this summer. Like there is no question he's just gonna sign the big deal.
Or will he be the first one that says, "Oh, that's the $300 million deal or in total, whatever it ends up being, that I'm going to." Will he be the first one to take substantially less? I say no, but
yeah, probably not. Probably not.
I mean, if
honestly,
Jaylen Brown didn't have to take less, I'm Jason Tatum. I'm like, no,
yeah.
I'll be taking the full amount. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would think so. Like the one thing that I think teams are going to start leaning on, if the cap does, I don't know that it's going to rise 10% throughout the rest of the decade. I would assume it's going to rise 10% or close to 10% for the rest of the decade. So if that's the case, that's going to outstrip the growth of salaries, right? Salaries go up only 8% every year, and that's not a compounding thing. That's just like 8% based off of the first year.
The
year, cap is going to go up 10%, and that is a compounding thing. So like the cap is going to rise, at least potentially, is going to rise significantly faster than player annual salaries will. And I do wonder if teams are looking that far ahead and are saying like, ooh, these next 2 years are going to be a little tight, but come like 26, 27, 27, 28, we actually are going to have more flexibility than people think we will, even if we do have 3 max guys, or in Boston's case, 2 max guys, and then Drew and Kristaps combine those two, and they're earning even more than a max guy. So like they're pulling off this model, and I think, I mean, once they have to replace Horford, that's going to be the big question, because like he is a key member of that team. If they can't replace him with Tillman, Cornett, or whoever, that they will have to fill that hole in their playoff rotation. But I do think Boston is going to be sustainable in a way that a lot of other teams won't be, just because they have all these guys in place. Like, there is nothing stopping them from re-signing Derek White other than a giant luxury tax bill and fear of the second apron. But like there are no second apron restrictions that prevent them from re-signing Derek White in 2025 if they want to, and I would imagine they would.
2 questions on this before I wanted to ask you more about like sort of the makeup of something. Do you think we see more players where, like, so the Kelly Oubre Jr. situation where it was Derek Jones Jr. signing for the minimum didn't surprise anyone. Kelly Oubre Jr. ending up there. Do you think there's a chance we see more of that because of the second apron, to where players might be thinking, I could, like a Malik Beasley with the Bucks, even I could get more somewhere, but if I'm on this team and I know I'm going to play, not even necessarily guaranteed a starting spot, but I mean, if you're in Phoenix, you might be guaranteed a starting spot, but I'm going to go here. And if I'm on a, not necessarily the best player on the team, but if I'm a top 5, 6 guy on a roster that goes deep into the playoffs, I'll be able to make more money from someone else because I know it's not going to be that team. Do you think because of the way that the depth charts will have been hollowed out, there should be some outsized opportunities for non-stars? Could we see more of those instances, but more deliberate, to where it's like he kind of, with Kelly Oubre Jr., felt like the market kind of fell out from under him when you look at the cap space landscape last year. Malik Beasley, I know that the Lakers declined his team option. He never would have matched it. Like, that felt like someone who would have had more options and actively decided against them because he wanted to start in Milwaukee. Do you think we see more of that, or is that still just going to be like kind of sparing more than anything else?
It wouldn't shock me if we see more of it, because I think there are 2 other changes in the new CBA that will impact the market for those players in particular. One of which being, I believe, starting this summer, teams can use their mid-level exception as a trade exception. So I wouldn't be shocked if some teams just don't spend. I mean, hell, already some teams didn't spend their mid-level exception, and they, pretended it was to maintain flexibility, but really it was just to deduct their luxury tax. do more teams not spend their mid-level exception in free agency because they want to maintain it as a trade exception going into the year? If so, that's going to cause the market to fall out from some of these types of players, the like fringe starter slash high end bench player type. The other being, now you have to hit the salary floor by the first day of the regular season.
Mm.
Under the previous one, you could wait till the final day of the regular season, and the only penalty is you just had to give the money, whatever the shortfall was, you disperse it to your roster, no big deal. Now you have to hit it by the first day of the regular season, or you have to pay the difference to the NBA. You don't get your share of the tax disbursement from all of the teams over the tax, which is already a deal breaker. I mean, no team is going to give up. That's typically like an 8-figure payment. No team's giving up $10 plus million because they didn't want to hit the salary floor. And the NBA adds a cap hold onto your roster. So like even if you're willing to give up the tax disbursement, you still are at the salary floor at the first day of the regular season. So like teams are going to be forced to spend to hit the floor, but do they? I think we've seen, who was it? Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports reported the other day when he went into a lot of the Sixers options that they took notice of what Indiana did last summer with Bruce Brown, where they signed him to this giant 2-year, $45 million deal, and everyone's like, "What the hell are they doing?" He was earning like taxpayer mid-level exception, and all of a sudden he's earning $20+ million a year. Second year team options, they had flexibility. It's effectively a 1-year deal, and they end up using it as the main salary filler for the midseason Pascal Siakam trade. So, do we see more teams follow in those footsteps? And like Jake mentioned, I think Klay Thompson and Kentavious Caldwell-Pope as two guys who, if the Sixers strike out Paul George, OG Anunoby, LeBron James, all their top free agent targets, do they do like a 2-year, $50 million deal for Klay Thompson, second-year team option, and with the intention of, once we get mid-season, let's say Brandon Ingram doesn't get traded this summer, okay, now we've got the salary filler that we don't have right now. I think one of the problems for them going into this offseason, if they're going to try to trade for Ingram, Jimmy Butler, whoever, they don't have anyone under contract. They have nothing to trade back except for draft picks and cap relief, but I don't think those teams are looking to give up. You're not trying to like salary dump Jimmy Butler or Brandon Ingram. So all of that is to say, I think we're going to see more of these short-term balloon deals. So that's going to really benefit some guys, but the guys that don't get it, all of a sudden, like once teams hit the floor, we might start to see more guys having to settle for the minimum, and possibly being more selective with where they sign, seeing like, oh wow, this team's got 4 guys on max or near max contracts. They're not going to be able to sign anyone else. Like maybe I will actually have a sizable role off of the bench or even in the starting lineup for this team.
That was even my second question that you kind of touched on, is do we see second apron teams kind of do the balloon thing too when it comes to their own free agents, where you're looking at Phoenix with Royce O'Neal, or like some of these, or even Boston, where it's like, well, we're going to pay Luke Cornett more because now we have salary matching. If we do want to make a trade, a 1-for-1 trade, and maybe you're able to attach draft equity to it. I do wonder if when you're a team like Phoenix, when you just don't have as much draft equity to trade, well, it's okay. Well, having Royce O'Neal on this inflated deal, what does that actually do for us? You, I guess, would have to be willing to take back money another team doesn't want, but a player that can still play. I've gone back and forth on whether I think we'll see more of it. I feel like we'll see more of it, but then I'm also wondering, like, well, what is the actual utility there? Because in Boston's case, it's if you just have a large salary and you can attach some draft equity to it and they want to make a bigger swing, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But if you're Phoenix, and I know they could technically trade 2 first-round picks this summer before that sweet spot where it's the draft is no longer a future, but the draft pick also doesn't count as salary, because then that would be aggregating salaries with one of their bigger salaries. But like, does it not make as much sense for them? Because one, Royce O'Neal can't be, unless you're doing a sign and trade in that point, but like Royce O'Neal, if you're signing him, can't be moved into the deadline. So it's, if you don't have draft equity available, well, how valuable are these inflated salaries really?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I would not be shocked if we see that type of thing where teams are willing to do this with the intention of trading them later. The only problem being, like, you're taking a risk, and if you can't trade them later, you're going to pay an even larger luxury tax bill. And that won't matter as much this coming season, but I believe in 25-26 is when the I think the tax brackets like explode basically, and you're paying like I forget the exact specifics, but it's a crazy amount of money. Like it's repeater tax level money, I believe, for even teams not in the repeater tax territory starting in 25-26. Like once you get out of those first couple tax brackets, you're paying an outrageous amount. So, our team's willing to stomach the risk of okay, we will hopefully be able to trade this guy, but if we don't, we're gonna pay like $7 per dollar that we gave him. Like, are we willing to pay $70 million to have Luke Cornett on the roster when it comes to his salary plus luxury tax? Because that's what it might end up functionally costing.
So this kind of shifts gears in a more of a wholesale way. But when you're talking about, and I think this also ties into the playoffs and maybe with what we're looking at, whether it's 3 stars or 2 stars, what is the archetype that you kind of know where it's like, oh, one of those stars needs to be, or I would even take it a step further to include the 2-star fashions. It does seem like when you're looking at what Dallas has been able to do, I know their defense has received all the credit in the world and deservedly so, but their 2 top guys, even though people have said stuff about how passive Kyrie has been at points in the postseason, their 2-star guys are excellent shot creators. And only and none of them are undersized relative to their position. And at least one of them, though, is also this like floor general, where Kyrie's an okay passer and as your second guy, but if you want him running the whole show, there might be limitations to what you're able to do that you don't have because Luka Doncic is there. Is that model maybe more important than ever to where you're looking at, even the Clippers feel like they decided having that floor general person that can have absolute command of the floor was critical because they went out and got James Harden when they had Kawhi and Paul George. And then Boston somewhat similarly, and they never really got that player, but they decided to make it up by like we upgraded the playmaking maybe from Marcus Smart going to Drew Holiday, and like we have Derek White. So there's like this huge committee. We have Jason Tatum as a passer. You can run some stuff through Al Horford still if you want to. But is there, like, combining the 2 issues, is there any lesson that you think that you've learned or you're watching or themes that have been, well, this is working in the playoffs, and then if we're actually going to spill over into, well, these teams, let's just assume that a team is going to build a 2-star roster and then flesh out that from there, or if they're going to go the 3-star route, like what has become most critical to making sure that's not successful just when it comes to lasting and excelling during the regular season, but actually excelling when it matters most? Because look, we're seeing a team in Dallas that it's not a super team. They made, right. I think they made smart use of the deadline. I totally whiffed on I shit on all those acquisitions. I was clearly wrong. But I think what we're seeing the limitations of, like with Minnesota, they have Anthony Edwards, and I know that he has not been great, but because they don't have that next guy to generate shots or have absolute command of the game, even if you have Jaden McDaniels or Nah hitting threes, like Dallas's defense just doesn't care. And so you're missing that element of it. I would argue, even, I know most people think if OG never gets injured, the Knicks will beat the Pacers, but like they still didn't have that other guy other than Jalen Brunson. The Pacers did in Siakam and Halliburton. So maybe that wasn't guaranteed. Is that something that you're also kind of watching for through all this, where we're not only talking about 1, 3, 5, but it's okay, well, one of them needs to be like an absolute floor general, and then the other guy needs to be no worse than like kind of a cut below that, or at least maybe not even close to the same level as a passer in terms of elevating everyone else around him, but needs to be that elite second shot creator too. Because look what happened with Denver when Jamal Murray was either injured, or not either injured, but when he was injured throughout this postseason. Michael Porter Jr. wasn't built. And even Aaron Gordon, like the moments you have where he's bringing the ball up the floor, just wasn't built to complement or provide that safety net in the same way.
Yeah, I think like the simple answer is you want as many players who can shoot, dribble, pass, and defend as you could possibly mass.
Right.
And much easier said than done, obviously, and those players tend to be the most expensive. So therein lies the dilemma of, okay, like we want to get 3 of those guys, but it's really hard to acquire them, and it's going to be even harder to build around them moving forward because of all of these new rules. I think what's been cool about these playoffs is that a lot of these teams are like stylistically very different, and it goes back to Maury in his end of season press conference is basically saying like there is no one formula to win a championship. Like there is no
Right.
one right
Okay.
way to build a roster, other than you want shooting. He's like, we have enough evidence at this point that shooting is actually important, and you need guys to knock down
I'm still
shots.
not sure that Rob Pelinka and company got that memo.
Right. They're still working on that, even though they won a championship with that exact model a couple years ago. Didn't learn the lesson that they should have from that, but maybe better late than never, maybe. So yeah, I mean, I think you obviously want elite shot creators, but you also want elite defenders. You want you want guys who are as versatile as possible, so that I think what's happening to Minnesota right now is really interesting, right? They just knocked off the defending champion in an impressive 7-game series, and I think they were favored coming in against Dallas, and now they're down 3-0 against Dallas because Dallas with Kyrie and Luka have kind of this versatility, or at least the shot creation, especially in crunch time of these games, that Minnesota does not have. So Minnesota, like everyone was saying, like, oh wow, Tim Connolly did such a good job. He designed this Minnesota roster like specifically to beat Denver. And that might be true, but then you run into another team that's built very differently in the next round, and it presents a whole new set of problems. So I think you want to be targeting versatility as much as possible, which again, easier said than done. Like those players also tend to be very expensive. But it's honestly why I'm very bullish on the Knicks moving forward, because I think they have a lot of that on their roster. And, they, as you and I have discussed, they also have the flexibility this summer to maybe make a big swing for someone. I don't know if they actually do it. Maybe they just run it back and say, with everyone healthy next year, we would have made the conference finals if everyone were healthy this year. And maybe that's the case, but like they also have the opportunity with the expiring contracts of Julius Randle and Bojan Bogdanovic. Like maybe they do go into the market and are a surprise destination for one of these star free agents or one of these star trade targets that are being bandied about.
I would just wonder, it does seem like, and we did touch on this already, it seems like we're not going to see teams, at least as deliberately, to where look at how much Cleveland gave up for Donovan Mitchell. The small, like the two small guard stuff, Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell, or even right now with the Knicks, like if Donovan Mitchell becomes available, they'll be mentioned. But you already mentioned this with the Sixers. He doesn't necessarily make sense. Maxi's in Philly and Jalen Brunson's in New York. But I am wondering if you are building a team, and I know you said that, and it wasn't a cop out, like you're right, the versatility matters more. But would you rather have the setup and flesh out your roster from there? And I'm talking specifically 2 stars. And I know there are other kind of I'm looking at 3 separate combinations here. You have what you have going on in Dallas, where it's a bigger floor general, and then with Kyrie Irving is just this like elite second star who's just an offensive wizard. Or you have Boston with Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, super versatile. Both play like you want those wing spots, those to be moved around on defense, and then they can generate their own shots. And Jason Tatum is, what is he, like a B minus, a B playmaker, which like to say above average for what he's supposed to be. Or you then kind of have, I would call it like there's Denver with Jamal Murray and Jokic, or there's the Lakers with LeBron, kind of a bigger floor general, and Anthony Davis, like the elite big man. So kind of throwing out who's super versatile on defense and he's more of a play finisher on offense. If you kind of had to pick you're starting your NBA franchise and forget about the age. I know LeBron's older, but like forget about the ages. Just look at sort of the archetypal setups here. If you had your druthers of the 2 stars that you want to have them and then work your way from there, what makes the most sense from that perspective? I'm only asking you this because the thing with the 3-star combination is that even if you're only signing minimums, in theory, it does give you more of a margin for error where necessarily maybe the archetypes don't matter as much if you know they're all going to be healthy and they're all X good. Like it still matters, but the thing with 3 stars is that you are invariably, in most cases, going to overload on something. And you just hope that something is so much better than your weaknesses or more pronounced than your weaknesses that you're able to outstrip it. So if you're looking at, okay, I'm putting together a team, I get to flesh out my 2-star prototypes from there. how are you, like, what is your preference, or what do you think is the most efficient way to build out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would lean toward the bigger playmaker, if only because of the challenges that presents for opposing defenses. Like, I mean, Luka has shown, especially in this series, like Minnesota had the best defense during the regular season, just gave Denver a ton of trouble, and Luka is just destroying them. They have no good answer for him.
Mm.
So, Luka is obviously one of one. You can't just say Luka Doncic, like you can't look at like a Cade Cunningham and say he's also a bigger playmaker, so he's definitely going to turn into the next Luka Doncic. Or like LaMelo Ball is a bigger
Right.
playmaker, so he's definitely going to turn into the next Luka Doncic. But I do think those guys present some matchup difficulties just because of their size, and you can't stick a traditional point guard on them. So, especially if they are your primary guard and you don't have Kyrie next to you where you could hide a point guard, like where do you even park your point guard defensively? I think that's going to be a challenge for teams that run into, if whenever Cade goes to the playoffs or LaMelo goes to the playoffs, like I'm interested to see what sort of challenges that presents for the opposing teams, although Detroit has Jaden Ivey for the time being, so maybe that won't be an issue. So I think I would lean that way. But again, I just would go back to like, I don't think, like, I never would have thought Dallas, especially prior to the trade deadline, never in a million years would have thought they would be 1 year or one game away from the finals. And
Right.
even after the trade deadline,
Yeah.
I mean, they were one of the best teams in the NBA in like March, I think, right? They went like 16-4 at one point, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And even still, it's just, well, this is March, it's noisy. Like, how much can we read into this? Like, their defense was incredible, which, as it turned out, was exactly what was going to happen in the playoffs. But I think a lot of people at the time, myself probably included, we just figured it's late season NBA. How much can we really read into this? So, I think it goes to show, like, Dallas is the perfect example of, like, this is not even a traditional 2-star build where you have 2 stars and they both are guards effectively. And you I don't want to say cheap out, but you went for inexpensive wings and inexpensive centers from a salary perspective. And just because those two are such good playmakers, Luka in particular, like, you don't need your center to be a shot creator when Luka Doncic can throw you a game clinching lob like he did with Daniel Gafford in game 3 against Minnesota. But no, it fundamentally comes down to who you have to. I think you just basically need to tell your roster around who is your number one guy, what is that guy's ceiling. For Dallas, Luka's ceiling is MVP. Luka's ceiling is best player in the NBA. Like, even Minnesota, same way with Anthony Edwards. And I think they're going to be a really interesting one to follow, because you could argue that they are not really built to maximize him right now. Like, they are built in a way that, again, led to almost unprecedented success for them. But I would not be shocked if 2 years from now, this Minnesota roster looks a lot different than what it does right now, because it has become clear that this is Anthony Edwards' team. It is not Karl Anthony Towns' team anymore.
I think I agree that I would probably prefer, and I wouldn't have said this before or after the trade deadline either, and maybe it's sort of prisoner of the moment type thing, but Dallas's setup seems like it's the best way to build out because of how much of a premium what Luka and Kyrie do are in the postseason when you're going up against elite defenses. And even just I might have picked Jokic and Murray before the start of the playoffs, but like Murray's been inconsistent even before he was injured. Like, that's just a thing that's been ingrained into his entire career. And you sort of need that like 360-degree scoring where it's like Jokic can pass and score in a lot of different ways, but like sort of that face up from the perimeter, try and beat guys off the dribble or take like the contested jumper falling away. That's not what he does. And I think you need that player. And when you have two of those players, I think it gives your team a higher ceiling than maybe looking at all of your parts on paper implies, where it's like the sum of everything Dallas is doing right now makes so much sense that maybe it is outstripping relative to talent. I mean, but like, so it's like the proof is kind of just in what they're doing. But if you would have asked me this question before the trade deadline, and that's why I'm like in my like I might have just for years might have been like, no, it's the Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum setup. Like I'll figure out how to plug in the playmaking to like give me the guys who are going to give you borderline elite play at both ends of the court, and also being able to generate their own shot from multiple levels. And I think that Dallas is honestly, especially in the age of this new CBA, where I'm looking at it through the lens of like, I don't think teams are going to, unless they're homegrown or two of them are homegrown and you go out and get another one, sort of like if OKC had J-Dub and Chet and then like they went out and traded for Shea type deal. I'm looking at it through the lens of having two superstars is going to become the new norm. And Dallas is like swaying the ever living shit out of me just based off what and it's like you look at it and yeah, okay, no Kawhi in round one, but like they're beating real teams to like get like their path to the finals is not easy by any respect, especially compared to what Boston's going through. And no road to the finals is easy. I want to make that clear. Beat the team in front of you, but like they're and they're doing it. I don't even know if this shows like the importance of the trade deadline too. Whereas maybe acquiring James Harden at the trade deadline, that doesn't swing your championship odds because it's such a massive piece that you have to integrate, and that is better served in the offseason. But they get glue guys, role player guys, no one who was expected to be more than the third best player on their roster at the trade deadline. And it kind of swings them in this, like it becomes a series of swing moves for them. And so again, maybe I'm just getting caught up in the moment here, but I look at that and I'm like, there's a level of duh because Luka is one of one. But it's like even stepping aside from that, like if you just gave like Donovan Mitchell like another 4 inches or something, like I might prefer like the Darius Garland Donovan Mitchell setup then, because we're not talking about elite defenders at this point, but it does get higher. It gets easier to hide them positionally on defense if they are bigger. And I don't know if that just shows how weak-minded I am and how easily swayed I am, or if it's just a testament to what Dallas has built. But I'm looking at it through that lens now, and I'm like, I think it's them for me. I'd rather work my way back or work my way out from those two archetypes than even a LeBron AD. Again, throw the ages out. Feels like it might have the most balance when you're looking at it from the perspective of if we're building the 2-star models, and then Boston's is the most versatile. And I'm just looking at the premium that Kyrie and Luka give on offense, especially because of Luka's size as part of that. And I'm like, I think that's the one for me right now. I know you said there's no one formula. I think that was important, but I threw you on the spot anyway, because I thought it was just an interesting discussion. It's like, what would be the preference if you're trying to just start from scratch type deal?
Well, it's interesting too, because that's you mentioned like you would prefer the Boston model, and that's the gamble that the Clippers took in 2019. Like that was their exact vision with Kawhi and Paul George. It's like these guys are elite, two-way, both good shooters, both have some playmaking in them as well. Like we think that they are going to be able to kind of do what has happened in Boston over the last couple of years. And unfortunately for them, it's just been Kawhi's health. It's been the one major roadblock in their way this entire tenure. But there have been times where the Clippers look like world beaters. For half of this season, they look like one of the best teams in the NBA, and then for half of it, they look like one of the worst.
Is there anything else about sort of the super team 3-star, 2-star dialogue that we didn't touch upon that you want to discuss?
Yeah, the only other thing I'd say is like we just need to be careful with the framing, which I think we've been doing a very good job of here. And like there's a difference between 3-star and 3 max. And we as we touched on earlier, even like 35%, 25%, there's a difference there. But like 3-star is definitely not dead, because there are stars signed to
on rookie scale
contracts. Right, rookie scale, but also even like a DeJounte Murray, who is signed to 4 years, 114 million. Like
that looks like one of the best deals in the NBA. Give me the fringe all-star making 12% of the salary cap.
Like I would very happily trade for DeJounte Murray this offseason. And I think his contract should give him more value, because he could be in a 3-star build, but he is not costing anywhere near what a 3rd star would cost. Or same goes with Mikal Bridges. Like people call me crazy because I've said Mikal Bridges, like between him and LeBron for me as number 1 on like the Sixers free agent trade target list. Mikal Bridges is earning $23 million or so for the next 2 years. Like that's literally half of what Paul George is eligible for this summer. I would much rather be paying Mikal Bridges $23 million. Like Paul George is the better player than Mikal Bridges, but the flexibility.
No, the Paul George discourse is I agree with you. I'm just saying the Paul George discourse I had floated there are Knicks fans that wouldn't trade Julius Randle straight up for Paul George. And I get the concerns about Paul George's next contract, but I'm like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, that's I'm sorry, but that's wrong. You should be very like if it is really just Julius Randle and Bojan Bogdanovic for Paul
Even
George,
if
you
it's a
should.
pick, I'm still doing it
Yeah,
because it's
yeah,
you're not exhausting all this now we're just so far field, but like you're not exhausting all your assets, and it's just you're keeping the Villanova crew, you're not exhausting your depth, but then you haven't necessarily played your best hand. Like you
yeah,
can then you have all these other like if you need to rejigger the roster, you can. And so it's just like Paul George, even if you think Julius Randle in a vacuum because he's younger is the better player, Paul George is the better fit
yeah.
for how you want to play at this point. So
You'd be running back this year's playoff rotation, adding Paul George and subtracting effectively nothing, or swapping out Bojan for Paul George. Like that's,
if you
I
play,
would
I
take
mean,
that
you'd be
gamble.
playing. You're basically just subbing in Paul George by the end of it because you didn't have Julius Randle
Right.
or
Right. So yeah, I mean, like I think guys, that's who I think smart front offices are going to really try to target is guys on either below max deals or guys on descending contracts. Like I know Kyle Kuzma seems to be radioactive among a lot of fans, but Kyle
Shouldn't
Kuzma's
be.
deal goes down every year. Like that's going to provide you with some flexibility if you increasingly will provide you with more flexibility every year if you add him. Or like I know Denny Avdia is a popular name that every team thinks they're going to steal this summer for absolutely nothing, even though the Wizards are not going to do that. But like he's another one on a descending contract for the next couple of years. Like those are the types of guys I think if you are looking to do the 3-star thing and 3 max thing, those are the types of guys that I think you should be aiming to target or aiming to acquire because I think that will make this more sustainable in general. But yeah, I mean, I think overall there's just more nuance in like the super team era is not necessarily dead. I think it
It's more
will be possible.
complicated. It's probably the best
Right.
way to frame it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you just need to have if you don't have a good front office in place, you're probably screwed. Like like salary cap experts are going to be so
Or if you
much
have
more
a,
important.
or if you have an impulsive owner,
Yeah.
shout
Oh
out
man.
Matt Ishbia.
Right. Right.
Do you?
Yeah.
I guess that makes me think though. So like Jalen Brunson is an interesting case here. So if he signs his extension, he'd be projected to be on a deal that's like 22% of the salary cap in 2025, when he could technically be on one that would be 30 or 35% of the salary cap, depending on if he met the did he meet the 35? No, because he didn't make all NBA last year, did he? No, he didn't.
No.
So if he made all NBA again, he would be able to qualify for the oh no, wait.
No, because he got
Anyway,
traded after. Yeah.
yeah, I forgot he
He's
got
stuck on
traded
the
for a
30.
minute.
Yep. Yep.
Or didn't get traded, but switched teams.
Yeah.
So, like,
All right.
that's a
Yeah.
big difference from 30% of the salary
Yeah.
cap. But do you think it's like, are we going to then see teams become more extension oriented? And then is there an incentive for players to operate the same way? Where Jalen Brunson's interesting because you look at it as, oh, he's still relatively young and he's been on 2 below market deals now for his career, but it's also, you're with a team that oversaw your rise to superstardom, and also you're not super young. And then what's the free agency landscape look like? Do you think this could just lead to an increase of the extension cases to where you're getting the max extension of these sub max players, but like they're not going to be anywhere near their max salaries?
Yeah. Yeah. I could like because Mikhail's a good example of that. His extension it can be 140% of his final year of his current salary. So I think it's like 38 million is what the starting salary of his new deal could be, and by the time he becomes a free agent, his max salary is probably north of 50 million. So is he? Yeah, I know. I mean, we saw it with DeJounte though. Like, I never would have thought DeJounte Murray would have signed that extension this past summer.
I'm pretty sure we just said it when we were going through their like preview. Grant, I was like, well, DeJounte Murray's extension, there's no way he's going to sign it because he's going to make way more money by us. But
Right,
nope.
and like he very well could have, but how do you turn down 114 million dollars? Like that's just a life changing amount of money.
That's what
And
Anthony
so
Edwards is going to be making in 1 year come
yeah,
2033.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, DeJounte might have some regrets. All these guys who were born now, they're just mad that they like all their kids. Like Kenyon Martin Jr. is thrilled because he's if he hits his ceiling, he's making $100 million in 10 years. But yeah, I mean, I think I could definitely see more guys. Again, I think there's just going to be some group of 3 stars at some point is going to take significantly less than their respective maxes to team up and kind of turn the system. And because I think it's going to become increasingly clear, like as more Phoenixes burn out, and if like the Clippers burn out, if the Nuggets collapse under the weight of the second apron, I think it will become increasingly clear to stars throughout the rest of this decade, throughout the rest of the CBA, that like this is our way around it. Like if rings are the only thing we're really concerned about, like we are going to basically have to choose between give myself the best chance of winning a championship or take the most amount of money. They are not necessarily compatible in ways that they once were.
I do think inevitably, if not already, that we're just going to see title windows shorten because there's going to be so much turnover. And the actual final thing, and it was on my bullet point list to ask you, when you're talking about sub stars, though, who are still very good, and it might be in the DeJounte Murray bucket. Let's look at OG Anunoby.
Mm-hmm.
There was a team, I'm assuming, in Philly that will give him the max, the 4-year max to come, 4 years, 181, 182, whatever the exact number is. But like, so maybe this is a bad example, but like, could we get to a point where it's the OG Anunoby types, very clearly a top 50 player or whatever, but they just won't get the maxes, or we'll have reverse. I called it reverse sticker shock, where it's, oh, look at how much they didn't get, or look, they didn't get the max. Is that something to monitor when you're like has the pool of guys maybe that would get the max money in most years if they're going to be free agents, is that now going to shrink? I'm not even talking about just because they're old, but again, OG Anunoby, it seems like there's a market for him to have a max somewhere else. So I think he would just get it. But is he the type of player that, I don't want to say could get squeezed, but like his market value now shifts because of the way teams will be planning their finances?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's going to be the Knicks. Maybe they'll say, we're willing to give you the max because we know you're getting this max offer from another team, but we would prefer to sign you to 4 years, 150 million, 4 years, 160 million. And here is why. Like, if you are willing to take this, it is going to give us a better chance to surround you with more talent. It's going to increase your chances of winning a championship here. Like, you can, I that's how I would honestly present it if I'm in a front office. Like, we will give you either one of these offers, but if you take the higher one, it's going to impede our chances of building a championship caliber supporting cast around you. Whereas if you take less money, then we're going to have X, Y, and Z available. We're going to be able to aggregate contracts, and we're going to be able to, we're not having these draft pick freezes, or we can't, trade this draft pick 7 years in the future. So we will have more flexibility on the trade market to make these midseason trades. And look at what Dallas just did, or look at what Indiana just did. They just made these big mid-season trades, and now they're in the conference finals. Like these moves, having the ability to make these moves in season is important for our chances. So I would just try to be honest with the players and appeal to them, and like, look, this is still an unbelievable amount of money that you're receiving. I mean, like Michael Jordan didn't make this much money throughout his entire playing career in terms of his NBA salary. And
yeah. So I always get uneasy when it comes back to, well, players need to take less so that teams can properly build. However, the only thing I will say to that is that, like, to counter my own stance, what is the collective bargaining agreement called? Collective. This was collectively bargained by the players union and the league. And if one of the offshoots, whether it's unintended or they knew it was going to happen, that's just going to have to be something that, and you know what? OG doesn't have to take less. Like you said, they could explain it to him. I do think this is going to become more common, though, because of the way how punitive it is as you get up to the second apron levels, if you want to sustain or to have a certain amount of talent. I would also say this is super important as to why you need to follow Brian on Twitter and all his work at BToporek, BTOPOREK, and all the work he's doing, which I'll ask you to shout out one more time, just because I'm listening to podcasts that I really like, the team-specific podcasts. The hypotheticals that are getting thrown out there in terms of what teams are able to do this offseason, it's important to have the league-wide perspective because they're more likely going to understand the limitations of the CBA, whereas you can't aggregate salary because you're creeping up on the second apron. That's why you subscribe to this podcast, Hardwood Knocks. That's why you subscribe to the NBA podcast. There's value in those national perspectives that are going to be a little bit, I think, teams guys who cover their own team, who cover their own team, they're going to be all in on it. But this new CBA is super complicated. And so whenever you see a fake trade being thrown out there, especially if it comes from an aggregation, Twitter account, you should go double check with Brian or something to make sure it's legal. We're going to see a lot of just missteps, I think. But other than that, this was great. BT, thank you for giving me so much of your time. You're able just to tell our listeners once more where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you do.
Of course. Well, thank you for having me as always, Dan. You can find me on Twitter, as Dan said, BTOPOREK. You can find me writing about the Sixers at Liberty Ballers over at SB Nation, covering just overall salary cap stuff at Forbes and doing some occasional stuff at BR now. Because, I mean, as you said, I think honestly the baseline assumption now, if you see a fake trade, it probably is illegal if it involves the second apron team. So just if it doesn't involve one of the cap space teams, you should be skeptical that it is even functional. But yeah, it does not help the content
and if you ever see two second apron teams trading with one another in a hypothetical trade, I can almost guarantee you it's illegal. Right. Unless those players are making the same exact salary.
I'm wondering if teams just start signing guys, like even if you don't have the non-taxpayer mid-level, if you just sign them to the exact dollar amount, just to have it as like a.
Or do we see more flat salaries to where it's just easier? It's just like, oh, Royce O'Neal got 15 because there's a number out there that's around there.
Do they collude on like, all right, there's the $8 million tier, the $12 million tier.
This was great. I'll be pestering you again in the future, and I will
Please
talk to you soon. Thanks so much again, Brian.
Of course.